Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Chris with SBC, and today we're going to be talking about the Basic Boa 101. Basic Boa 101 requirements in their care to be able to take care of one of these guys and have a healthy, thriving boa constrictor. This is my girl Mahogany. She is a hypo jungle that is 100% het for blood. She is amazing, she's gorgeous. And she had more of a mahogany colored tail when she was younger, but just kind of since browned out. I don't know if you guys can see it very well on that camera, but she's just an awesome snake. She's gonna chill with us while we go through this. Let's go ahead and dive in. Alright, so if you're watching this video, you're probably thinking about getting yourself a brand new boa constrictor. And that's great, and I want to keep things super simple for you because if you've taken the time to look on the internet, or if you've taken the time to get on Facebook and get active in some groups, it can get really frustrating with how complicated things can get real fast. So for just the sake of keeping things simple, I'm going to give you the basic fundamentals to take care of one of these guys. That's going to be your temperature, your humidity, your enclosure, and feeding. I'm not going to tell you exactly how you have to meet these requirements, but if you are interested in knowing how I hit these requirements, feel free to comment and I'll go over that with you guys in later videos. Alright, so first up, and probably the most important thing about keeping your boa constrictor is going to be your temperatures. Your temperatures really do affect so much with these guys' health. They are cold-blooded animals, so they're going to need you to provide a temperature gradient of one hot side and one cold side in their enclosure. That hot side needs to be about 88 to 95 degrees. The cold side needs to be about 78 degrees, and the ambient temperature inside the enclosure needs to be about 80 degrees. It really is important to provide that temperature gradient for these guys. These guys are going to use that hot side to be able to digest their meals. If they eat and they don't have anywhere to get to that 88 to 95 degrees, they aren't going to be able to digest their food appropriately, and that meal is going to rot inside of their bellies, and then you end up with a regurgitation event, and that's not fun to deal with. It's very hard on their bodies, and there's a whole process to get them back eating again. If they don't have that cold side to be able to thermoregulate to, they can't overheat.
I'm baking like a toasted cheese here. It's so hot here.
If they start to overheat, they show neurological disorders. They'll start to corkscrew, they'll start to stargaze a little bit, they might become overly defensive. So you need to provide that temperature gradient for these guys so that way they can thermoregulate appropriately and they can digest their food appropriately. So that was an 88 to 95 degree hot spot, a 78 degree cold side, and an ambient temperature of 80 degrees. Alright, so another really important thing to bring up when it comes to temperatures is going to be your thermostat. Every single one of your heat sources needs to be regulated on a thermostat. This is going to keep your temperatures from getting too high. If your temperatures get too high, again, you can see neurological issues going on. The snake might become overly defensive, they might corkscrew, they might wobble, they might become overall uncoordinated. That thermostat is also going to be how you're going to set that 88 to 95 degree hotspot. Something else to keep in mind is that you need a way to double check your temperatures. I do this by using an infrared temperature gun. I get it from like Home Depot. Basically what I'll do is I'll use that to check the temperatures inside the enclosure, on top of the bedding, and below the bedding, because those are going to be two different temps, and they're also not going to match what your thermostat is reading, especially if you use underbelly heat like me and have that temperature probe between that heat mat and the enclosure. The thermal interference just changes it a little bit. So I have my thermostat set to 103 and 104 degrees, but that maintains that perfect 90 to 95 degree hotspot inside the enclosure. I checked that with that infrared temperature gun. So that should wrap us up for temperatures. Now next up is going to be your humidity. Your humidity needs to be about 50 to 80% on the inside of your enclosures.
Jeez, it's humid.
Now the question is how do we keep our enclosures at 50 to 80% humidity when we're in a house that's probably not 50 to 80% humid? Well, we do that by restricting the airflow to the inside of the cage, restricting that ventilation. I have found that a 50% ventilation rate across the top of the enclosure with some regular maintenance misting usually gives me that 50 to 80% humidity rate on the inside of the enclosure. Now it is important to keep these parameters in place for these guys, but these guys are really hardy animals. If they go above 80% or below 50% for just a little bit and you correct it, it should be okay. They should be fine. They can handle it, but the ideal percentage is 50 to 80%. Now there are a couple things that we can look for to know, both from our animal and the environment, if we need to bump those humidity levels up or down. Of course, you can go get one of those digital dials that let you know what the temperature and the humidity is on the inside, but these are always subject to be off, so it's important to just be able to read your animal and the environment they're in as well. If your humidity drops below that 50% mark, then you'll start to see things on the animal like stuck or PC sheds. Those will usually be your first indicators that your humidity needs to be bumped up a little bit. If your humidity stays below 50% for too long, you start becoming at risk for things like constipation and impaction. So it's definitely advisable to not let your humidity drop below 50% for long-term periods of time. Now again, these guys are hardy animals, so if it drops below 50% for just a little bit and you bump it back up, you should be okay. On the other end of that, if your enclosure goes above 80%, then you'll usually start to see things like condensation on the inside of the enclosure, or the overall enclosure will start to feel damp. These are usually your first indicators that you gotta find a way to lower that humidity a little bit. Again, these guys are hardy. If you catch it, lower the humidity right away, they should be okay. If they stay above 80% humidity for too long, and they have nowhere dry to sit, they're at risk for scale rot. If the air becomes too stagnant, being above 80% for too long, you are at risk for respiratory infections. So this would bring me to, if my humidity was going to be too high or too low, I would prefer it to be too low than too high, just because of the risks that are associated with too high of humidity. But the right proper parameters are going to be between that 50 to 80% humidity rate, and then that should wrap you up for humidity. Alright, so next up is going to be enclosure.
Gotcha! Ooh,
What for? You did this! I am Boov.
I know what you are.
Yeah, can I come into the out now?
Enclosure is going to be pretty simple. I'm not going to tell you what you can and can't use. I'm going to tell you the parameters that your enclosure should hit. So that being said, you should have an enclosure that holds humidity well, holds temperatures well, and provides the appropriate amount of space for your animal. So let's go ahead and break that down. You want to have an enclosure that holds temperature and humidity well for obvious reasons. We just got done talking about how important temperature and humidity are for the animal's overall health. If you are going to hold temperature and humidity, that brings us back to ventilation. I've noticed that 50% ventilation rate does a really good job at holding temperature and humidity in. You can do this with DIY caging if you're going to add ventilation. You can do this with custom-made boa file cages or animal plastics cages. Any kind of PVC cage is usually good about holding temperature and humidity, opposed to brands that incorporate screen tops. Now, you can do it if you use an enclosure with a screen top, but you need to find a way to restrict that ventilation to be able to hold in that humidity and temperature. But that should take care of the ventilation part and the holding in the temperature and humidity part of your enclosure. The next is the size. Now, what is the proper size for our enclosure? Now, there is a minimum, and keep in mind that this is a minimum. An enclosure should be 1 square foot of floor space per 1 foot of animal. Now, if your animal is 4 feet long, there should be 4 square feet of floor space inside of its enclosure. Again, keep in mind that this is a minimum. If you decide that you want to go bigger and you can provide more space than that, just keep in mind that the bigger that you go, especially if you go taller, it is going to be harder to heat that enclosure and harder to maintain those humidities, and then you might have to use multiple heat sources. It just depends on how big you go. But the minimum size requirement is going to be 1 square foot of floor space per 1 foot of animal. Now, the next thing is what is the size of the enclosure that I should be using for the size animal that I have? Now, I know we talked about the minimums, but what about the extremes? If I have a baby animal, can I put that into a 4x2? Well, the answer is yes. You'll hear a lot of people tell you that no, you can't do that, that it'll stress the animal out being in a space that's that big, and that's true to an extent. You should just provide them multiple hiding spaces and give them plenty of areas to feel secure in a big space, so that way they can move from hide to hide to hide. But you can put them in that bigger, larger enclosure, though they also do very well in smaller enclosures too. So that's just something to keep in mind whenever you are getting an enclosure for your new boa constrictor. And that should wrap us up for enclosures. Alright, so last up is going to be feeding.
Bon appetit!
Now, feeding I'm not going to go super in depth in, just because feeding topics and feeding videos are its own topic in general, and that can run a whole video by itself. But I will tell you that I will never feed anything wider than the width of the animal's body, and I feed on a frequency of about once every 2 weeks. If you start feeding too heavy too often, these guys are opportunistic feeders. They will probably take the meal, but if you overfeed these guys, they grow very, very quickly. And it was documented by Jeff Ronnie that when his animals grew that quick, that they died in about half the lifespan. It shortened their lifespan by almost half. So I just recommend not necessarily slow growing your boas, but grow them at a nice consistent rate. Give them an appropriate sized meal at the appropriate sized time, something about the width of their body once every 2 weeks, and then you should have a very healthy, thriving boa constrictor. If you feed them something that's too big, much wider than the width of their body, you start risking regurgitating. And then if you start feeding them too often, then you also risk regurgitation. But that's when power feeding really comes into play, is that you're feeding the snake too often. You're feeding it weekly versus every other week. If you feed something a large mouse once a week, you're technically power feeding it. You should probably feed it on a frequency of about once every other week. That's what I do, and that's what I would recommend doing, is just looking at your animal, judge by the width of them. Don't feed them anything that's wider than the width of their body, and feed them on a frequency of about once every 2 weeks, and you should have a very consistently growing boa constrictor. Alright, so that brings us to the end of our basic boa 101, what you need to know to be able to take care of one of these guys. Promise, once you have these 4 fundamentals down, your temperatures, your humidity, your enclosure, your feeding, you'll have healthy, thriving boas down to a science.
It's alive! Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
It really doesn't have to be super complicated. Don't overcomplicate it. Don't overthink it. It's just keeping boa constrictors, and it does not have to be stressful. Again, look at this girl, Mahogany. She's just been hanging out with us the whole time. She's such a good girl. If you guys got anything out of this, like, share, follow, comment, subscribe. Greatly appreciate it. Y'all take care.